Um, I can speak loudly as well. You talked about, sorry, in the framework of Islam and liberty, you mentioned that only 4% of the ayahs of the Quran actually contain rules. So do you think that those 4% should be applied?
Sorry, can you the final part of the question?
Should those 4% of the ayahs that actually do contain rules, should those rules be applied in modern society?
If we look at the rules themselves, the majority of those rules are actually about things like worship. Things like, in fact, this will go deeper into the definitions of these different parts of Sharia. The first thing that I would like to let you know that even though only 4% of, or less than 5% of the verses of the Quran have rules, the majority of the rules, like Sharia, if you actually look at the books of fiqh, for example, you will find them to be full of rules which are not from the Quran. Because we have other sources, being the hadith. The hadith are basically narrations attributed to the Prophet or attributed to the people around the Prophet. You also have a lot of what we call scholarship. In fact, someone actually, and I've been actually trying to look at find the exact source, but I think someone estimated that over 90% of the rules that we have are actually not from the hadith or from the Quran. They're actually a result of successive scholarship. People opining, giving their own opinion about what would be the right thing to do in this context. Now, as for whether they should be applied or not, I mean, should we fast or not? Should we pray or not? When someone dies, how should we bury them? When someone, when two people want to get married, then what is the right, what's the rights and responsibilities on either side? A lot of these things are actually, for example, the biggest verse in the Quran, which is called Ayat al-Dain, the verse of the loan. It's almost an entire page, and it reads like legislation. It covers the subject of when you take a loan from someone, how should you authenticate it? And you go through it and you look at it and it's like, okay, it's a good idea. We don't really follow it because the verse says do not basically write it even if it's small or big, like basically whatever the amount, even the amount is small or big, but most of the time. When I borrow money from Usman to go and buy a meal or something, I don't actually sit down and write a contract between the two of us.
We should do that.
But what I'm saying is that the reason why maybe I kind of answered the question in a roundabout way. What I'm saying is that we overemphasize certain parts of those rules, and we underestimate, or we do not emphasize other parts of the rules, and it's an open question why we do that. As I said, a lot of the rules actually are about spiritual or worship matters. They're actually between 6 to 9 verses, which are corporeal or basically punishments, legal punishments. And those legal punishments, actually, by the most modern, or let's say the most contemporary interpretations, are kind of superseded. So, for example, let's accept the traditional interpretation that says that if someone steals, you should cut their hand off. Which again, I mean, there are certain people who kind of challenge that interpretation, but historically that's what was done. But even if we accept it today, if you actually go to traditional scholars today, they say, yeah, but we don't do that anymore, because the times have changed, the context have changed, the social context has changed, And now what this really means is that we have to criminalize theft, but we're kind of flexible on how to do it. So when you actually look at the rules, you will find that you will be surprised by how much it is shaped by human scholarship. That idea that we actually have commandments and we're kind of like taking those commandments and applying them, that's not very accurate. A lot of them are actually, human interpretations upon interpretations upon interpretations that take into consideration the current social context, the current political context. Like, for example, we're talking about, if we're talking about that verse, about, that if someone steals, then chop their hand off, in 50 years, we will be able to reimplant hands. Then what happens then? What happens? Should pose that question to a Salafi and we'll have some interesting answers because surprisingly, even back then, certain body parts could be reattached. Like if you cut off someone's ear, it was actually possible to reattach an ear because you basically just stick it and it just sticks. So surprisingly, there is scholarship about whether you can reattach a severed hand or something like that, and there's also positions about it, and everyone disagrees, and everyone, there's so many different opinions, etc. But what I'm trying to tell you eventually is that when we say should it be implemented, the word implemented itself, even in fiqh, even in the traditional framework, which we can discuss and debate how valid it is, but even within that framework, the political context, the social context, the general context of the here and now is taken into consideration.
You were talking about the paradigm shift within the Islamic world, or in the world generally. I'm always wondering, if Muslims are believing in an almighty God, if they believe he has power over everything, how is it that they can't understand that God is the one who is creating diversity? And how can you make them understand this?
I normally point to the Quran, by the way, because there is a verse of the Quran and which explicitly says that I'm actually going to read it out from the Quran app. Interestingly, this is something that maybe we don't talk a lot about, but Muslims kind of understand that the Quran is more liberal than the Hadith, and the Hadith is more liberal than the scholarship. We kind of project our own understanding and our own problems on the text. So the verse, I'm going to read it in Arabic. It's from Surah Hud. It says, وَلَوْ شَاءَ رَبُّكَ لَجَعَلَ النَّاسَ أُمَّةً وَاحِدَةً وَلَا يَزَالُونَ مُخْتَلِفِينَ إِلَّا مَنْ رَحِمَ رَبِّكَ وَلِذَلِكَ خَلَقَهُمْ. إِلَّا مَنْ رَحِمَ رَبُّكَ وَلِذَلِكَ خَلَقَهُمْ. It says, basically translating, not very well, but translating, if God wanted, he would have made all people one nation, the whole humanity into one nation. But they will always be diverse. And the next verse says, except it's kind of difficult to translate, but إِلَّا مَنْ رَحِمَ رَبُّكَ, except those who God have mercy upon, and that is why he created them. وَلِذَلِكَ خَلَقَهُمْ. In other words, he created people to be diverse. There are those little things between the verses that we normally don't really pay a lot of attention to it, because again, when we go in and look for rules only, we miss a lot of this stuff.
Because Muslims feel superior. That's what
there is also a sense of supremacism, and I think that the supremacism is kind of a cover for an inferiority complex, to be honest.
And
When you
with-
feel inferior, you kind of project it outwards and you say, oh, I want to feel, I want to plug that by supremacism.
Second question, it's about values. We're talking about values. In the Quran, when Quran is dividing humanity in two different parts, it says mu'min and kafir. Over the years, I've been trying to understand it as it is in the context of the Quran. What I have understood is that mu'min means human who is doing good things to others, and kafir means someone who is doing bad things to other people. And it doesn't divide them by Muslim mu'min or non-Muslim kafir. What I have seen in the Quran. What do you think about it?
Well, I would say it's slightly inaccurate to say that there are only two categories, mu'min and kafir, because you have a spectrum really, because remember that there's mu'min, there's Muslim, there's munafiq, there's kafir, there's alladina kafaru, there's al-kafirun, it's different, it's slightly different. There are all the different kinds of Ahl al-Kitab, Ahl al-Kitab, alladina utul kitab, there's so many categories. And again, I agree with you in a sense that
To finish it, in the values part, can we unite as Muslims from different nations and religions under the values as Muslims?
again, there are maybe around 4 years ago, I actually attempted to read the Quran in exactly this way. In other words, basically read it and say, I'm just looking for values. I'm not looking for rules. I'm trying to basically have a very deep and very slow read. And that was one of the things that stood out, that there is this concept of what we call salvific exclusivity, which is a concept that says salvation is only limited to Muslims. Many Muslims believe that. And I think the Quran does not really support it so much. And again, this is something that we can debate back and forth. But I think the message of the Quran is that people's salvation really in the end depends upon their actions. Eventually, historically speaking, we ended up emphasizing creed a lot, emphasizing the correct belief a lot. The Quran does speak about the correct belief, but only in the context of the right action as well.
Right. Any other question?
My question might be a bit off topic, but I think it has something to do with liberty. I'm from Pakistan, and we have a very old and controversial regulation about respect, so to say, of the Prophet called blasphemy law, which dates back probably to the colonial period or even before that. And the problem is that actually there is no space to debate about the legitimacy of this law, and people have been murdered based on actually calling the law debatable. So I'm just wondering, if you are familiar with it, where does it date back to, and what was the background of actually such kind of law to be created in the first place? Does it actually originate from a period of Khulafa, how can people create a space actually to get rid of it?
Well, the laws that are currently in place in Pakistan are colonial era laws. Historically, if you want to speak about the historical backdrop of blasphemy and apostasy laws, blasphemy or heresy laws in general, I tried to do a study about this in a sense that I tried to make a list of different personalities in Islamic history that were very publicly either executed or humiliated or whatever, under the guise of either blasphemy or heresy. And my conclusion is that whenever something like this happens, there is always a political reason behind it. In other words, someone might have said something or written something, and then 16 years later, when he happens to fall out of favor of the political authority, or he backs a rebellion, or he communicates with a competing military commander or political authority, suddenly we realize that, oh, he's a heretic. The period of history that had the most of this was the early Abbasid era, when the Abbasids were trying to regulate, they were trying to create an orthodoxy. So basically, they tried to say, this is the right belief, and if you don't believe it, then you're out of favor. You have to be punished. And this was done during the time of Al-Hadi and Al-Mahdi and Al-Rashid and Al-Ma'mun. Al-Ma'mun changed, he kind of adopted what we call a position called Al-Jahmiyyah or Al-Mu'tazila, again, debatable. It was really an attempt by the state at the time to get the right to decide what is correct belief. So when you want to decide what is correct belief, you want to have that power to say that this is the correct belief, and I have the legitimacy because I'm the one who's protecting the faith. So what you do in that case is that you have to go after everyone who doesn't believe that belief, and you have to go after him. The result of that was basically a reduction in diversity in Islam, because the people who were persecuted were also Muslims. I share your frustration in a sense that it's sometimes difficult to convince Muslims about this, mainly because a lot of passion enters the argument, especially when we're talking about things like, for example, insulting the Prophet, or we're talking about things like insulting the companions, etc. There's a lot of demagoguery around it. And I don't really have a solution for Pakistan, to be honest. Maybe because when I speak to Arabs, I can always say, go back to the text. I can say, open the book, read about this, and you can see that it's not as black and white as you think. In the case of non-Arab Muslims, there's an interpretative layer, because they have to go to a cleric, and the cleric will explain, because they can't access the text directly. And many of the texts are not available they're only in Arabic. And I share your frustration. I mean, I hope that we can move in the right direction.
Our Prime Minister was challenged on this in the UN Convention, and he didn't take a stand. So this law is definitely there to stay.
Well, they don't take a stand because it's politically convenient.
Yeah.
It's unfortunately, it is still convenient. Let me not even say unfortunately, just a fact of life, that it is convenient to project yourself as someone who's protecting the faith and protecting Islam, etc., because that actually gains you some cookie points among the population.
I'm not sure whether this is in fact a relevant question, but then I was wondering that during the course of your speech, you mentioned that there's a general decline in orthodoxy within Islamic space as well, which leads to sort of a more heterogeneous and a more diverse settings of Muslims. And I suppose, in some sense, that also creates a vacuum for supposedly French elements to come sort of play to a greater sort of involvement, and which, of course, so then there is a general, I feel there's a trade-off that this increase in diversity also comes at the expense of introducing more violent agents into the system. So, but why? I mean, this is sort of a evolutionary process for many different religions. But why is it that in the case of Islam, we see such a, well, why is it more pronounced, if you see my point? I don't know if that makes sense.
I'm just going to rephrase your question, because it was an excellent summary as well. We're talking about when structures become more flat, we're saying that we see a transition from a more homogeneous Islam to a more heterogeneous Islam. Interestingly, this is something that people who study religion know. Religions are normally internally diverse, and they evolve internally. Over time. And this is not just Islam. All religions basically are internally diverse. I would suggest different words than homogeneous and heterogeneous. I would actually suggest heteronomy and theonomy. Heteronomy means something which is subjected or something which is subject to a law external to itself. Meaning someone writes the law and you follow it. That's heteronomy. Theonomy would mean the law being basically you being infused with the divine law, which means that you choose to follow the law, but it's something which is more from inside you, from within you. Autonomy means you're subject to your own law. I like to use this because I think really what we're really looking at, I think what I would like to see happening is that we move from a heteronomous Islam to a theonomous Islam. Meaning that we're still infused with the moral values of Islam, and yes, the rules when it comes to worship, but we're no longer looking at a horizontal kind of control kind of relationship, but more something that's more flat and more you have more agency in a sense of picking the interpretation which you feel is more in tune with with your own moral sense. So one thing you mentioned is that when this happens, when this kind of transition happens, whenever you accept so many different interpretations and you have this collapse of centralized legitimacy or centralized control, you will have a space, the space will be also open for fringe elements, such as ISIS in this case, and different Salafi jihadist groups and different extremist groups, which is of course very valid. The fact is that it's easier to build an extremist group than to build an actual from the ground up Renaissance or evolution or Reformation. And I'm using Reformation here very uncomfortably because some people associate Reformation with a capital R Reformation because they kind of try to draw parallels between Christian history and Islamic history, which doesn't really match. But what I'm saying is that it's easier to actually go and blow stuff up than to sit down and create a new epistemology and build a new moral theory on top of it. Which is why always this kind of transition is always a time for monsters. It's always a time for a lot of upheaval. When people ask how is Islam changing, and you look at now, this is what it looks like. ISIS is part of the process. And it's ugly, but that's how it happens.
You were talking about Reformation, and there are a lot of people who are engaged in these debates, or either pro-Reformation or anti-Reformation, and some even say the things you're saying, that you cannot emulate the Christian Reformation. What is it about this? What do people expect about such kind of Reformation? And is it confirming that there is an intrinsic problem with being a Muslim?
The whole idea of Islamic reform, I use the word Islamic reform, but I mean it I kind of translating from Arabic, Islah. Islah means to make fit again, to fix or to make fit again. So when I say Islamic reform, I kind of translating from Arabic. I say what I really mean is make Islam relevant again in our lives, and especially if you have faced modern life, you always feel like there are some points where you feel I need moral guidance, and you feel the answer is not easy. It's not as easy as follow the set of rules. Anyway, what reform looks like in an Islamic context, because Islam doesn't really have a centralized clerical establishment, reform really, the way that it looks like is that it's a shift in the mainstream. Because you have this diversity in Islam, at certain parts of history, different kinds, different interpretations of Islam were either mainstream or were sidelined. And what decides what interpretation is mainstream and not is not truth value. It's normally power. And we have seen in recent years, in like let's say since the 1970s, that because of the situation, the twin situation that Islamic capitals are not producing a lot of culture, there's no intellectual output, and at the same time, let's say it, Saudi Arabia had a lot of money. In this space, there's a vacuum, and the vacuum was filled by Wahhabism and a lot of oil money. And I know Wahhabis don't really like to be called Wahhabi, but historically, actually, there was a time when they actually didn't mind being called Wahhabi. But this achieved this kind of mainstream shift, because what happens is, and interestingly, the most dangerous part about it is that this mainstream shift happened at the level of epistemology, at the level of how do we decide what is true and false? How do we understand? How do we interpret? This is sticky. It's going, that kind of interpretative layer is going to be with us for a while. And it worries me, and I think that's why if you want to challenge, if you want to actually speak Reformation, we have to speak at the level of the epistemology first. And I think this is what we're doing over here. A lot of the talk over here has been at the lowest level of understanding. I mean, how do we understand?
I'm thinking, let's forget the Islamic countries with Islamic population. Let's forget how Muslims in general are understanding Islam today. My question is, in the European countries, Muslims like me, like Usman, like you, we have no problems to integrate the Islamic values with the, let's say, Norwegian values. For me, Norway is one of the world's most Islamic countries, literally. And when we have this comfort, how can we make these young people who have this identity crisis and going around with their jalabas and trying to feel a part of something when they actually already are living in a country which is more Islamic than any country around the world today? How can people like you or Usman contribute and help the Norwegian government to help these children from not getting radicalized or to get more integrated into the society and feel comfortable?
Well, it's interesting that you describe Norway as one of the most Islamic countries in the world. In 2015, I believe, 2014, there was an Iranian academic, and I forgot where, in which university, but he actually tried to do a ranking of all countries in the world according to Islamic values. And he found out that in his ranking, Ireland is the most Islamic country in the world. And there is no Muslim country in the top 30.
Yes.
I think the first was like at 37, it was Malaysia or something, and interestingly, Israel happened to be more Islamic in that sense than a lot of Muslim countries. So I understand what you mean over here, but we're not talking about Islamic in terms of models or in terms, we're basically talking about Islamic values. The thing about values is that because they are so universal, they don't make you feel unique. And those two questions, who am I and what am I here for, basically meaning and identity, are probably the deepest questions ever that anyone can ask themselves. Which is why one of the functions of society is really to answer these questions for people who are growing up within that society. At a previous time in history, you knew you didn't have a lot of choice, you didn't have a lot of freedom, but you grew up in the same profession as your parents. in the same sect, in the same the same kind of practice. If you're a man, you had the camaraderie of other men. If you're a woman, you had the camaraderie of other women of different generations. So these societies kind of knew how to give its own members a sense of meaning and a sense of identity. It came with a lot of other stuff which is not exactly good, but it accomplished that. One of the side effects of us having a very open society is that we don't tell people these things. We leave it up to them, and this is one of the greatest things about modern society. But I share your concern that we really need to have models. We really have to have a way for people to really be able to explore this. In my opinion, one of the biggest things that you can do is really read up on history. And I always emphasize this to a lot of young people. In fact, the last time I did i'tikaf in the United Arab Emirates before my expulsion was 2013. And i'tikaf is basically where you basically live in the mosque for the last 10 days of Ramadan. So you're living in the mosque, you're basically sleeping on the ground with other people. And a lot of them were young people. A lot of them were young people who are really interested in all of these questions. And what I did at the time was that I started to speak to them about Islamic history, because they were asking me some questions that were very alarming. Like a 16-year-old boy coming up to me and asking me, are Shias Muslims or not? And he's a young guy. I don't blame him, but it's a question that that is alarming. So I sat down, I started to speak, just basically say, this is our history. And don't take my word for it. Do not believe anything I say. Everything I tell you, go and verify it. Okay? And this is where I actually ran into this problem, that they cannot verify it because they don't have access to the text. The text is not in their language. And they don't have, even the versions of that text that were translated were edited. So there's a lot of stuff that was removed. But the reason why reading history is so powerful in this case is because it actually gives you a sense of where you come from. It gives you that sense of provenance. This is my story. This is the story of how who my people are, where they came from, etc. And it dispels a lot of myths, because a lot of our stories about ourselves are actually mythology. A lot of our nationalistic stories are actually myths. So simply reading up on that, we actually humanize our own history and humanize our own oppression narratives. Every people have kind of an oppression narrative, which says that in our history, we were good and those people were bad, and these people oppressed us or whatever. For Palestinians, it's the Israelis. For Israelis, it's for Jews, it's basically everyone in history, because they were persecuted in so many episodes. For Kurds, it's the Turks, and for Shias, it's the Sunnis, and for Sunnis, it's different. Today we talk about Crusaders and Zionists, etc. So there's always an other, and we're always projecting all the bad in the world on the other, and all the good in the world on ourselves. And whenever you go down and actually read the text, and you can see that things are not that black and white. You kind of come up with a more humanistic understanding of your own identity, of your own history. That's what worked for me. For me, when I had an identity crisis, I went and read I read a lot of Islamic history, and that worked for me. And I'm sure that there are other ways to do this as well. But I think that it's actually a good way to get young people to actually get a sense of their own identity. There's, of course, a lot of other stuff that can be done, and some of the stuff is really, like you mentioned, for example, the government. So it has been acknowledged for a long time that we can actually talk about a civic nationalism. A civic nationalism means that we can actually have a Norwegian nationalism which is not built upon ethnicity. But in order to have that discussion, we have to talk about what are Norwegian values, and whenever some people talk that brown cheese is Norwegian values, it kind of derails the discussion. I believe that whenever you try to brainstorm or crowdsource what are human rights or what are values, they end up being the same across the world, because human beings are human beings. maybe there'll be interesting takes, but more or less it'll be the same. So I think it's a discussion that's yet to be had. How do we define what is the origin story that I would give my own son as someone who's going to grow up Norwegian? Of course, he has a hell of a story because he became a refugee as a 4.5. Actually, he was born a refugee, but he kind of became a refugee again at 4.5 months old. But I'm talking in general, speaking generally, there is a sense of feeling not here or not there, and this actually happened with as we're talking about the story of the two sisters, the Norwegian Somali sisters. There is this feeling that they don't feel Somali, they don't feel Norwegian. If they go to Somalia, they're not exactly. No, but I was actually thinking that maybe instead of joining ISIS, if they went back to Somalia and explored their heritage and explored where their parents came from and lived there for a while, they would come to a different conclusion.
Exactly.
Maybe we should allow people to explore their heritage, explore it in a safe way.
I did it, and I found out that I am actually not Kurdish or Turkish. I am Norwegian. But before going to Turkey, I was thinking I had a lot of from both cultures, but that came out very clearly when I lived there, that my set of mind is.
And you're better for it today. I mean, you're better because you made that trip and because you made
to value my Norwegian side much more.
And I think that's great. I mean, that's something I think that is part of the solution as well. And I think it's important for us to have this discussion. I mean, the more we talk about this and the more we talk about how did different people deal with it, I think we can start to build something which is really useful for. And
like you said, it made me comfortable in my identity coming back. Now I'm comfortable with saying I am non-ethnic but Norwegian.
Yeah.
Like you say, I don't have any identity crisis.
Yeah.
Yes.
And but we have to acknowledge it. I mean, what I'm saying is that now that you know who you are, you have a clear sense of identity. Do you remember what it feels like to not have it?
Yes.
You do.
Yes.
It's terrible.
It's terrible.
Exactly. If you have a well-developed sense of identity, you're very privileged. You're very privileged. You have no idea of the sense of loss and the sense of the sense of directionless when you don't. It's such an essential question. Who am I? So we should not minimize it. It is a very serious question.
I have had a chance to go to some religious events here during Ramadan, where just out of curiosity I wanted to learn how are the contemporary scholars trying to attract the masses. And I was very surprised to see that actually the pull, it's not the pull of the good, but it's actually the fear of the sin which is being used to get more people to come and listen to them. And what it does is that it creates you create a box and you kind of judge everything with a certain criteria which makes it not a sin. And then anything outside of that box, even if it's good, if it doesn't lie with your framework of values, you would kind of not tolerate that. And I feel that to help individuals get out of this box, it's actually maybe there should be something done at the level of instructors or the scholars. And I feel like even they don't have an understanding about what they're talking to these people and actually shaping their minds. So I think there should be some kind of guidance for the scholars maybe.
Well, I think in Europe it's quite a problem, this issue of scholars who are not trained within the country and don't understand the context of the country. More and more people are understanding it right now, and I think some governments are considering to say that only natively trained scholars can speak in mosques and teach. However, the point that you mentioned about how there is an emphasis on sin, when I started to leave Salafism, and I started to kind of look back and look at the people who were still Salafi, who were used to be my friends or used to be my colleagues, I started to see that there is this sense of fear of life. It's as if the basis is no. The basis is I should not do that. The basis is, the default answer is not yes, it's no. And in a way, I kind of understand that if you're living in a world where you feel threatened, that would kind of be your reaction. There's also the point that, because if you're talking in terms of Sharia, this is the opposite of Sharia, because in Sharia we say that al-asl fi al-ibaha, the essential nature of things is to be permitted. In other words, everything is permissible unless stated otherwise, and not the reverse. But the attitude is understandable in a sense that if you are prone to that kind of to feeling out of place, feeling scared, feeling that your identity is being challenged, then of course you're going to be more responsive to that kind of rhetoric. And yes, I mean, there is also a matter of lack of training, because sometimes if this is someone who is not trained to understand the social context in this country, of course they will not give the right advice, or they will not give the right information even.
All right, 2 more questions.
Yeah. Maybe there's a question that that can be answered quite shortly. So where in the world, or where in the Muslim majority world, is the best intellectual climate to have this kind of conversations that you had here? And also, I don't know about your professional experience in the Emirates.
Well, this will be kind of easy to answer because there isn't. The most interesting discussions that happen about Islam happen outside the Muslim world, or they happen online. Even there are very interesting discussions that happen within the Muslim world. Normally they happen online, because that's the space when people feel it's a more open space than the actual physical space. The public sphere in the Arab world, or the Muslim world in general, has gone online, because there's a shrinking space outside, But even then, people are always threatened. So, for example, some of the most interesting discussions on this used to happen in Saudi Arabian online sphere. Saudi Arabia is a very dynamic society. I mean, forget the political sphere, but socially speaking, it's very dynamic. But then, in a few weeks, all of these very interesting figures can end up in jail, and then the public that sphere is actually shut down. This kind of promotes the whole idea that this is why it's important to have these kind of spaces where people who live in the West, in free societies and open societies, have the ability to actually speak, because they have freedom of speech. They have the ability to speak without reprisal. The fact is that you cannot have an intellectual output without free speech. And the reason why, when I said that there was a collapse in cultural centers, and there was very low intellectual output out of the main capitals of the Islamic world, it was basically because of lack of freedom of speech. If you don't have freedom of speech, you cannot really have any cultural output.
You said earlier that the Quran is anti-clergy, I think. Could you elaborate on that, and maybe also give your thoughts on what kind of implication that has, for example, for the clergy we have in Norway?
Well, we say in Islam, and this is something that we kind of say as a popular saying rather than as a hadith or something like that. We say that there is no such thing as a man of religion in Islam. There are scholars, in a sense that there is no ordained priesthood, and there isn't monks. So we say there is no rijal deen, there is alim deen. There is no man of religion, there is scholars of religion. Within the Quran, you will see that there's a lot of criticism towards, or there's a lot of critique towards clergy, the clergy that existed at the time. We're talking about al-ahbar and ruhban. Whenever a new message comes, that message threatens to steal the congregation from the previous scholars and religious leaders. So I think this is what it really means, that anyone can be. It's open to everyone. Anyone can be a scholar in a sense. Anyone can be a learned man. However, historically speaking, what happened is that this was organized into a very specific top-down structures that were not essential to Islam. They were not essential. They were basically they just happened historically because of political reasons, or because the state decided to organize it in that way. That's not to say that the scholars themselves did not have a say in the organization. But I'm saying is that it was also, it was not completely independent. So it doesn't mean that we should not have any scholarship. It doesn't mean that we should have zero scholarship. It just means that the legitimacy or the authority of that scholarship is going to be less, because they don't have a means to let's say make sure that people follow those rules. In the sense, it's going to be a matter of trust between you and the person and whoever scholar they are convinced by. There's a lot to unpack in that particular question, because that discussion itself requires an event for itself. What will it look like in that case? And in a certain way, we're actually seeing some of it. We're seeing celebrity sheikhs, for example. We're saying people who are like religious scholars who have like 10 million or 12 million people on Instagram or on Twitter or whatever. They become celebrities in their own right. Sometimes they're not exactly the most knowledgeable. They just happen to be the most media savvy. And they end up being, basically having a lot of people following them, a lot of people, listening to what they're saying and taking them as role models, which is not exactly scholarship. But again, it's one of the signals. Basically, it signals that there are things that are changing, and it's an open question. What will it look like when this whole change runs its course?
Thank you, Sean. You always want to have long answers. I want to sum it up with a question of my own, and it's linked to the main topic here. We have talked about origins lengthily, and we have talked something about authority, legitimism. We touched upon freedoms, rights, and liberty. How can one, as a Muslim, have trust and fight for these liberties and find legitimacy by being Muslim and within Islam? That's the main topic throughout, for example, the Arab world these days.
Well, the language of resistance in the Arab world does not avoids using the word democracy, mainly because democracy is easily misinterpreted as elections and as change of government rather than a value of government. Basically, so you can go up to people and say, "Do you want democracy?" And they think, then you mean you want a new government to come along, and the last change was not really that helpful. The language of resistance is really two words: rights and citizenship. These are the two words which people are really using when they talk about reform, political reform. They also use civil society, the word civil society. And this is important also when it comes to, for example, interpreting the results of polls and surveys. Because someone might do a survey and say, "Oh, Muslims don't really like democracy." So maybe ask them, don't use that word. Ask them about rights, ask them about citizenship, ask them about agency, ask them about civil society, etc. And you'll see that things are changing. I think that, if we want to actually, again, sum it up, at the time Kawakibi was writing his book, this was 1902, literacy rates in the region that he was writing, in the Levant, were very low. And I don't have exact figures, but I think like in the mid 50s, in Iraq, for example, and this is something that I looked up recently, and I think the literacy rate among men was under 12%, and among women it was under 2%. So one of the biggest hurdles that these guys had to deal with is that they were mostly dealing with a mostly illiterate population. And when you fast forward to today, you look and you see that if you actually look at the literacy rates of young people, 24 years and below, it's almost 100%. In Iraq, it's like 80-something%. In Libya, it's 99.9%. In Saudi Arabia, it's 99.9%. In Oman, it's almost 100%. So, but at the same time, if you look at the grandparents, the literacy rate among seniors, 65 years and above, is like 30%. And this happened in one generation. In a sense, when your whole life revolves around struggling to simply feed your family, your aspirations are going to be different from when when you are educated. You want a job, you want to feel good, you want to feel your dignity. You will desire a different set. Your priorities will be different. So I think in the end, we're really talking about a social evolution, a maturation, a social maturation. And that is when people start to demand more. And I think in many Muslim countries, I think societies have come of age. Societies have matured. Of course, not uniformly, some more than others. And this is where you start to clash with the government and with the regime, which does not want to change, does not want to budge. And this is what creates instability. In that case, the regime or the state can do one of two things. Either it can try to suppress society, or it can simply simply try to become more inclusive in order to have a new stability. Unfortunately, most of them are not doing the right thing.
Too many examples of that. And a century ago, this Kawakibi writer wrote this book, and perhaps people can start reading it now.
Yeah.
Yes.
I hope, one of my dreams is to be able to write an English version of the book, which is as beautiful as the Arabic.
Well, we hope you interpret it quite well. Thank you all for coming today. We will put a recorded version online. Thank you, Iyad, in this autumn Oslo. And do be sure to follow Minaretten on Facebook. We have other events. The 3rd of November, we're going to discuss Islam and the West, favorite topic. And we're going to touch upon some of these topics. And the next, we're going to continue with this series to Islam and Liberty, and the next one will be in end of November, I think.
Yeah, it's going to be about radicalization.
Yeah, radicalization, another favorite topic. But have a nice day. Thank you all. Thank you.
So